Good day, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the second day of the two-day annual HPC AI Advisory Council Australia Conference. My name is Brian Sparks, and I'm the Director of Worldwide Operations for the HPC AI Advisory Council, and will be today's moderator. I'd like to take a quick moment to thank everyone at NCI for their partnership and support of this conference and for helping with the Council's mission and learning objectives. We have a robust agenda for the next 3 hours with great topics and speakers. I encourage everyone to ask questions via the Q&A window, and our presenters will try to answer them after their presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and the sessions will be made publicly available. All slides will be available on the Council's conference website over the coming days. With that, I'm pleased to introduce today's keynote speaker, Dr. Catherine Yelick. Dr. Yelick is the Robert S. Pepper Distinguished Professor of Electrical Engineering and Computer Sciences and the Associate Dean for Research in the Division of Computing, Data Science, and Society at the University of California, Berkeley. She is also a Senior Advisor on Computing at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. Her research is in high-performance computing, programming systems, parallel algorithms, and computational genomics, and she currently leads the Exabiome project on exascale solutions for microbiome analysis. Dr. Yelick was the Director of the National Energy Research Scientific Computing Center from 2008 to 2012, and she led the Computing Sciences area at Berkeley Lab from 2010 through 2019, where she oversaw NERSC, the Energy Sciences Network, and the Computational Research Division. She earned her PhD in Electrical Engineering and Computer Science from MIT and has been a professor at UC Berkeley since 1991 with a joint research appointment at Berkeley Lab since 1996. Dr. Yelick is a member of the National Academy of Engineering and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She is a fellow of the Association for Computing Machinery and the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences. She is a recipient of the ACM IEEE Ken Kennedy Award and the ACM W. Athena Award. Today, Dr. Yelick will describe some exciting opportunities and research challenges in applying AI to scientific applications, how this will impact the landscape of scientific discovery, and how it will change the demands for traditional high-end computing. Dr. Yelick, thank you very much for joining us today. You may begin.
Well, thank you very much, Brian, for the invitation to speak here, for the organizing committee, and for that great introduction. I'm going to really talk not at all about my own research. I'm going to talk about a lot of work being done by others, some examples of AI research, but how I see this really changing the landscape for science in general and specifically in high-end computing and science. So, why AI and what can it do for science? Well, the most obvious places where AI techniques such as deep learning are already being used across a number of different science disciplines is in data analytics of various kinds. So that includes the well-known examples of finding cats in images, so image classification with localization, object detection, and image segmentation. But in science, we can apply these same concepts to more complicated data sets and three-dimensional data sets. And what's shown at the bottom are examples of looking for hurricanes or other extreme climate events, such as atmospheric rivers, in climate simulation data. So this is now being applied to three-dimensional data and being applied to look for these very different types of events, but also based on the ideas of deep learning. And so you can see there's an analogy to all of the things we're more familiar with in images to these 3D scientific data sets. And I just want to point out that these changes are much more than just taking a convolutional neural net and applying them in this 3D setting to this very different data. It's non-trivial to take the basic concepts and adapt them in this way. This shows some results that were actually one of the Gordon Bell Prizes in 2018, looking at deep learning results on climate data. And the scientific result here, besides the exaflop of peak performance and, of course, narrow data type arithmetic, is that this is actually producing better quality results in the sense that the results are smoother than what had been used before in terms of heuristic labels. Now, as I said, this kind of data analysis is used all over science, and this is used in experimental science as well as the simulation data that I just mentioned. In this case, it's being used on neutrino data at the IceCube neutrino detector, and it's looking for pattern of light decomposition for these muon bundles. And this also was a Best Paper Award. In this case, it was at the International Conference of Machine Learning and Applications in 2018. And the graph on the left just shows that it got much better quality results in terms of reducing the signal-to-noise ratio by a factor of 3, but also increasing the sensitivity of the detector. So you can think of that as a sort of an accelerator for hardware or an improvement over the hardware, allowing you to get better scientific results from a fixed set of hardware as if you had done some kind of an upgrade to the experiment itself. And the last example is looking at the data from the materials project. So as in the climate case, this is looking at simulation data rather than experimental data, although both of them can be included in this type of framework. But this is looking at, rather than sort of an individual set of simulations, a massive number of high throughput simulations done to look at, as part of the Materials Genome Initiatives, really understand the relationship between a lot of different chemicals and materials and putting them into a large database. You can see some of the statistics here on what's in the database. There's over 40,000 users of this data, and now using that for screening to say, if I'm looking for a particular kind of material, how can I do that? And so machine learning is being used to try to understand that data and try to understand the relationship between different molecules. Just to give you a little sense of what it's like to analyze molecular data rather than analyzing images, even in analyzing images and looking at a two-dimensional convolutional neural net, many of the CNNs actually were not rotationally invariant. And what you can see there on the left two pictures is how the image is changing based on the rotation of that original image. And on the right-hand side is what they're using in order to train these for rotational invariance, but also in a 3D setting. And it's these little Tesla-like blocks. And there's a set of them that really define the basic shapes, and then looking at all these different rotations of them and training the neural net, a three-dimensional neural net with rotational equivariance, so that in any rotation, a single molecule will be considered equivalent. So some high-level questions are, how do we build the next generation instruments and simulations with AI in mind? Can we build instruments that are much smaller, cheaper, or faster because we know, rather than using them after the fact, as in the neutrino experiment, that we're actually designing it with the idea that we can use AI methods to analyze the data? Can we use old data sets for new discoveries, so reusing data in new problem domains and to make different types of discoveries? And I think an important question is how the AI methods will have to change. I gave a couple of examples of that, but I just want to make it clear that this is not just taking basic methods that are being used for things like searching for cat videos and applying them to scientific data. So the next example I'm going to look at is from generative adversarial neural nets, or GANs. And this is some work done at UC Berkeley by a team, and it's looking at making these people that are now superimposing these images and the dancers that have been learned from the previous video, superimposing them on the poses that will make it appear as if these two students, who actually are not very good dancers, appear to be dancing. And so that's a kind of a cute way of seeing the power of generative adversarial neural nets to analyze video data and then combine that to produce these kinds of videos. So what does this mean in science? Well, people are using GANs to build a lot of different things, including convergence map of weak gravitational lensing. So this is looking at, rather than running very complex, high-performance simulations that are very expensive, they run a certain set of those and train a GAN in order to produce a number of these other maps of the universe. And it turns out that these maps that are produced by the GANs are actually statistically indistinguishable from the ones that were built by high-performance simulations. So this is a much more efficient way of producing scientific data that can be used, that can be analyzed for basic scientific understanding. Another example of using these surrogate models or approximate models for things comes up in a decision support problem, which is in watershed management. So I didn't realize how complex it is, but analyzing or managing the water, even in just a state like California, is a very complicated, interconnected set of decisions that have to be made to decide, for example, what do we expect the snowpack to be this winter, and how much water then is that going to produce over what period of time, so you can decide how much water to release from dams and things like that. These are very complex simulations. If you're going to do a detailed simulation, that takes into account the weather and things like that. But using these GANs, you can actually develop a tool that the water managers can use in real time to make these kinds of decisions. So, high-level questions: what scientific data sets can AI accelerate? So, are there places where we can test instruments using AI-generated data, evaluate new theories using AI-generated data, or approximate expensive simulations and expensive experiments, as we've seen. But an important question, and I want to really emphasize this, is that there are a lot of fundamental statistical mathematical questions underlying things like these generative adversarial neural nets. So what level of confidence will we need in science in order to be confident that we can use these for things other than making really cute videos of people dancing and things like that? The next example comes from well-known, I'm sure well-advertised, and everybody who's familiar with this, AlphaGo Zero and using deep reinforcement learning to play games of strategy. So this is another strategic problem that comes up more in transportation, and it's really about how you manage the transportation system. In this particular video, there's one autonomous vehicle, and which is this dark maroon colored one, and it's actually causing the traffic to actually behave in a more kind of consistent way and then more efficient way than when you're using when there's all human vehicles. So it's using reinforcement learning to train that vehicle in order to optimize the entire transportation system and make it more efficient. So questions at a higher level: how can AI navigate these complex spaces? How they can be used to optimize complex systems, such as optimizing energy systems, IT systems, finding the best path through a set of experiments. So there are a number of examples that we're using in both simulations, where we're running massive high throughput simulations, or in experiments to steer the experiment using AI methods. And then, do the systems need to change in order to support automation? Certainly, the infrastructure and transportation needs to change in order to support autonomous vehicles, or at least it could make it much easier to support autonomous vehicles. How do we think about scientific instruments to take these ideas into account? Now, the next example is also very well known and is from Boston Dynamics and is looking at robotics. And of course, this is, I think, still to me amazing to watch. This robot, which has been trained with AI to do a backflip. So, great. What does this have to do with science? Well, in science, we use robotics all over in our instruments. But it's not just about making things more convenient, but it's about allowing us to control things that we can't control with a human hand. And really providing feedback, automated feedback from the experiment to really hone in on the scientific data that we're looking for. And there's many examples of how we can use very highly calibrated robotics in science as well. So how will robotics and automation transform our facilities? There's this phrase, the idea of the lab in the cloud. So imagine that just like we have cloud computing, centralized resources where we can do a lot of computing today in various domains. You can also have a laboratory of experiments that are automated and run by robots. Remote access to these experiments, so rather than having scientists have the lab in their own office space in their own building, having remote access to laboratories, and much higher throughput and more efficient laboratories from robotics and automation. We're using this, for example, the robotics are being used today in things like COVID testing, right? It has significantly accelerated the process of testing for a large number of samples for COVID. How will AI-trained robots enable new instruments? So are there places where we can't physically control them today? And this comes up already in areas like particle accelerators, but looking at things like fusion. And what level of confidence, again, will we need in AI in order to allow it to control some of these experiments, which may be much more complex than some of the types of controls that other AI systems are being used for outside of science? The next set of things are really more on the data analysis side and using techniques to extract signals from very noisy data. And hopefully you'll be able to hear this. This is some work that was done at MIT.
Mary had a little lamb whose fleece was white as snow. And everywhere that Mary went, that lamb was sure to go.
And this is what we were able to recover from high-speed video, filmed from outside, behind soundproof glass.
Mary had a little lamb whose fleece was white as snow. And everywhere that Mary went, that lamb was sure to go.
So what's happening in this case is there's a camera behind this soundproof glass taking a video of this bag of potato chips, an empty bag of potato chips, and you can't see it moving, but the camera can actually see these very small vibrations. And so what was reproduced there in this little song was actually reproduced not from the sound, it wasn't listening to it, but reproduced from the images, the video, and the vibrations on that bag. So now we're getting information from really, really small and very fine details in terms of images and video. So example in science was taking an image of the first image of a black hole using these various types of very high performance, high quality imaging techniques and very powerful mathematics and computation in addition to the images and the experimental devices themselves. And this next example of imaging is really doing 3D model reconstruction, and it is looking at how these images are analyzed. And this is, in this case, is MRI data from sparse and noisy data, but using physical constraints so that you know that there's certain properties of the system that you're looking at in images, and use that to exploit the low-rank structure of the image data and produce these high-quality images from very noisy and sparse data. And the last example in looking at this kind of very noisy data set is looking at metagenome samples. So this is where you go and pick up a sample of, say, soil, and you sequence all of the species that are in that sample. There may be thousands of samples in it. You find all the genes that are coding for proteins, convert those into proteins, and now we're trying to understand these proteins. And there are many proteins that we do not understand. We don't understand the genes and then what they code for, what the functional behavior is of those. And so this is looking at clustering these together so that we can hopefully understand from some protein that we already know about what it's doing. And this is actually a piece of the Exobiome project that I'm leading, but this particular effort is really led by Aydin Gulic. And this was a problem that was previously intractable. They were running it on shared memory machines, which is very common in a lot of computational biology problems, and now is being run at very large scales on systems like the Cori supercomputer at NERSC. So where can AI allow us to find smaller signals in noisier data? How can AI learn physically realistic models and design processes so that it can be used not just for analyzing this type of data and finding these very small signals, but really being used to design, for example, experimental processes. Now, AI, of course, is well known in speech processing, natural language processing, and being able to now understand somewhat imperfectly when you talk to your cell phone or and you're talking to some kind of a centralized database system, a lot of automation or even translation of languages from one language to another. Where does this come up in science? Well, there's a great example of this looking at, as part of the materials project actually that I mentioned earlier, looking at how you use machine learning to analyze scientific publications. There are a number of other examples of this around the world, but the interesting thing about this paper and the story about this work analyzing the abstracts from machine learning from material science papers is that the structure they found actually allowed them to construct something that looks like the periodic table based on the information that was in these abstracts. So there's a much deeper understanding of the information in the abstract and very specialized domain-specific information about that's used in the natural language processing that, well, it goes beyond just kind of general spoken language processing in order to get this kind of scientific information out. And actually, one of the things this team did early on in COVID was to take this tool and adapt it to the COVID literature. I don't have a particular graph showing the growth in the number of publications on COVID-19, but as you can imagine, the number of papers on the archive, on the biomedical archive, and places like this has just grown exponentially, and it's very difficult for scientists working in the area to keep up with all of that literature. So this tool called COVID Scholar gives them a more sort of semantically meaningful way of searching for information about the genes in the virus, about the proteins associated with it, about drugs and things like that associated with COVID-19. So not just kind of what you would get from something like a Google Scholar search or something. This has really got much deeper semantic information. So how will natural language, our language understanding, transform science? How can we use it to really enhance what we're doing already in our own research groups and in reading publications and things like that? But how will natural language processing also need to change for the scientific literature? So I already suggested some ideas about how it needs to change. And of course, there are other places. I was talking with another faculty member on campus who's using NLP techniques to understand literature and to understand the roles of individuals in literature and how those roles change over time in terms of, for example, gender roles over the history and different literature, and how NLP can be used to analyze very large sets of data in order to understand something about society. So just to summarize here, how can AI help in scientific exploration? I really divide this into these 4 categories. You can probably slice it up slightly different ways, but I'm looking at the data analysis problems that I mentioned at the beginning. So things like classification and regression, clustering and dimensionality reduction. So things like classification, where we are using supervised learning, so we know what the different categories are that we're looking for, and then some of the unsupervised techniques. And the techniques like deep learning have proven especially very powerful on the classification, and some of those types of supervised learning problems, and I think are being extended as well and applied now in these other unsupervised areas. Solving inverse problems. So this comes up all over scientific exploration. If you're trying to do something like design a drug or design a new material that has a certain property, and you want to solve the inverse problem of figuring out what is the thing that how do you build the thing that you're trying to build that has the properties that you need. You may not even know what you're trying to build. You're trying to figure out what material will have this property, and then a second step would be to actually say, how do I construct that? How do I synthesize that material or that drug or whatever? The next one is these various types of kind of high performance surrogate models. So very high performance in the sense that they're very fast to evaluate. So approximating very expensive simulations or very expensive experiments, and then filling in models from simulations that are based on first principles. So write down your set of equations, build a simulation for that set of equations, but where there are places where we don't actually have a first principles model, we can use data to augment that based on learned models that can be added to the simulations. And then in the last category here, we're really looking at design and control, so optimization of experimental designs so that you can very efficiently do the experiments, figuring out navigating a space, whether it's a simulation space or a space of experiments, and controlling the instruments, as I mentioned, very highly tuned and optimized instruments that need that go beyond sort of the human ability to control them, and then learning from sparse set of rewards, so that in many cases, one of the things that comes up in science, unlike some of the image analysis and speech processing, natural language processing problems outside of science, there aren't always huge data sets. There aren't always a large number of observations that you can use to train, say, a deep neural net. So how do you use a very sparse set of things in order to design and control? So I think that sort of summarizes, I think, some of the ways, and I'm sure it's just scratching the surface of the ways in which I think that AI methods, machine learning methods are going to really transform the scientific process, both computational science, but also experimental science. So what are some of the challenges that we have in terms of the computational, the methods, the hardware, the software, and the facilities that need to support this vision of AI for science? Well, I like to divide it into the kind of the three big pieces of what you need for machine learning. You do generally need a lot of data, although in some cases we will, for example, use reinforcement learning. We may be working in sort of a constrained space where we can be generating that data. We also need algorithms, so very high quality algorithms, in some cases methods that are really tuned or adapted or developed specifically for a scientific domain. And then, of course, a lot of computing power. So a little bit about the data. What are the kinds of data that we need? Well, I think we have data all over in science, and some of it is very powerful, very large data sets. But I like this quote from, I think it was from Jan LeCun's Turing Award acceptance speech, where he said that a lot of the credit for deep learning actually goes to the people that collected the big databases like Fei-Fei Li, and the people who made the computers go fast like Dave Patterson. Dave Patterson was in the audience with us as well. But I think the thing that we don't have in many scientific disciplines, although we're starting to get that, are these collected databases that have data that can be used to really to train deep neural nets in ways that are that demonstrate the differences with, say, an image processing data such as the one that they developed. And also, if you look at where are the big public data sets that are used in machine learning, there was a survey, and I've just got the link there on the bottom of it. So some other group that did a survey of the 50 best public data sets for machine learning applications, or for people that are developing machine learning techniques, and what are they applied to? Well, as you can see, there's a lot of image data. There's a fair amount of language data, a little bit of medical data. That tends to be hard because medical data often has privacy considerations associated with it. A little bit of government data, or reasonable amount of sort of government data. That means collecting databases on things like census data and things like that, and economic data. But missing from this list entirely are large scientific data sets from experiments, from things like material science, from environmental biology, and a lot of other application areas like that. So I think it's one of the challenges that we in the scientific community have, is to understand how to put these community data sets together. Obviously, we do have things like climate data. We're working on collecting environmental data and so on, but making them accessible to researchers in AI and machine learning so that they can also improve their methods based on these much more interesting, in some cases, and different data sets that come up in science. Using AI in science, it's very easy to sort of think about the methods, the machine learning methods, and kind of what comes at what I would call the end of the pipeline here, in terms of the data life cycle that's required. And certainly there's a lot of interesting work to be done on the data, on the machine learning side in terms of the methods, but there's also a lot of work that has to be done in the tools and the techniques and the infrastructure required to acquire the data. So we're collecting it from all different kinds of sensors and experiments, moving the data across high-speed networks from experimental where the experiments are to, say, a computing infrastructure, an HPC center or whatever, and cleaning that data. And often there is sophisticated mathematical techniques behind this. It's not just manual, hopefully. Being able to reuse and analyze and mine the data and then disseminate it for the community for reusable science, and then preserve it as well so it is easier to find data in the future. So, there's just a lot of these different pieces in terms of the edge devices and designing the computational devices that may go on the edge through the network, the statistical and learning methods, the distribution facilities, and so on. So a little bit more about methods and foundations. This is obviously a very deep and rich field with a lot of work going on. I think some of the aspects of machine learning and methods and foundations to think about are the performance and optimization of deep learning. So it wasn't just that hardware got faster, but that people figured out how to map those computational problems onto things like graphics processing units and really tremendously improve the ability to run these complex deep learning training algorithms and things like that. The foundations and understanding of deep learning methods, opportunities for traditional machine learning as well as deep learning. And I won't read through all of these, but things like uncertainty quantification and combining it with simulations and so on. Oh, and problems with limited data, I will mention. So one of the things that comes up a lot, and there's a couple of different terms that mean somewhat different things, but having robust, interpretable, and explainable methods. And this little graph, which was actually from a DARPA program manager, and is kind of a cartoon here, is just making the point that there seems to be a trade-off between the interpretability of the methods and the prediction accuracy. So things like deep convolutional neural nets have proven to be highly accurate in terms of their predictive capability and finding images and things like that, amazingly powerful. So very high up on the accuracy score, but we don't understand them. If you've got a deep neural net that has been learned from a whole bunch of data, it's very hard to take that apart in general and understand why did that model determine that there was a cat in this image or that there was a hurricane in this simulation and not in something else. So developing techniques that either augment our deep learning frameworks, perhaps having smaller models so that it's easier to interpret them, or having different types of methods that are easier to really come up with a scientific interpretation of. And there are, of course, well-known trade-offs in the speed and the parallelism associated with some of these deep learning methods and the accuracy that you get. So this is looking at the batch size, and large batch size gives you more efficiency in terms of being able to map it onto have high computational intensity, something we're very familiar with in high-performance computing, but can have a trade-off, and then the ability to avoid that sort of trade-off through things like this LARS technique, this layer-wise adaptive rate scaling, which is a technique for changing the parameters on the fly within the layers of the deep neural net. So what about software challenges? So on the software side, there's, of course, a whole ecosystem of both data tools and machine learning tools. And I think you can sort of put them on a spectrum here, as I've done with a very general purpose tools. So things like Jupyter Notebooks and tools like, and languages like Julia, infrastructure for data analysis like Apache Spark, to more specialized things that are really looking at machine learning, so things like TensorFlow and PyTorch and so on, and then much more specialized tools that are looking at particular domains. So the camera project at Lawrence Berkeley Lab is looking at the data problems and the machine learning problems that are associated with the data from the advanced light sources, these large experimental facilities and other sorts of DOE facilities of that kind. and things like CosmoFlow, which is really designed for this cosmological data. So you can see this whole spectrum here, and there's a tremendous amount of software available, but also a tremendous amount of software to write in this space. So what are the software questions? Does the software serve the needs of science? So if we look at something like TensorFlow or PyTorch, we may want to work on graphs. There's growing support for things like graphs inside of these, but do they really capture the type of scientific structures that they have? Will they work on our say, three-dimensional climate data with many variables per data point? Are they optimized for HPC systems? So initially, a lot of them were not really well optimized for HPC. They assumed that you had local disk, or they assumed that you had a fairly slow network, and make decisions about how to distribute the computation, the data based on some of those assumptions. And what are the gaps and opportunities? I think there are gaps in here in terms of places where tools that are being developed for commercial applications of AI and machine learning really may need to be augmented, or even new tools will need to be written for scientific problems. So what about hardware? Well, I'll go back to this issue of looking at AlphaGo 0, and this is a graph that probably many of you have seen, looking at the computational increase, or the computational requirements, and the increase from AlexNet in 2011 to AlphaGo 0 in 2018. So this is solving a different problem, and doing it now. And of course, AlphaGo 0 really without any kind of training data, but learning how to play the game of Go. And the y-axis here is the petaflop per second days. So the number of days it would take to train this on a petaflop machine, assuming kind of a perfect petaflop rate. So you can see incredibly expensive computations here required to solve these deep learning problems. And I think it was interesting to me when I look at this time frame from 2011 to 2017, the top 500 list. The fastest machine improved by less than about a factor of 10 in that particular time window. I think there's been some jumps since then, but whereas this workload increased by the total number of work required by a factor of 300,000. So these machine learning problems are producing just enormous computational challenges as well. And I've heard anecdotally that deep learning researchers at some of the companies have, say, 500 GPUs at their disposal in order to do their deep learning training. And that kind of computation is very hard for the scientific community, including the machine learning community, to come by. Now, originally, when we run HPC facilities, I'd kind of like the idea of just sending all the data to the HPC facility, where you do have a very efficient resource for whether it's a commercial cloud or an HPC facility, but someplace centralized where you have a lot of computing, a lot of data storage associated with it. I'm ignoring issues of cost here, but someplace that's efficient and centralized. But there are really places where the scientific instruments are producing data so fast that you cannot move the data away from the experiments. In some cases, we're actually doing computations on the sensors themselves. So, for example, you may be doing some kind of compression or feature selection. Some of that is so that you can get immediate feedback at the experiment about what is happening, whether the experiment is working, for example. But even more generally, you may need to compress that data or select for the data that you really want to save. You want to send over a network to, say, an HPC facility. Near the sensors, you may be doing real-time processing with things like FPGAs or other customized hardware where you're doing some amount of buffering and real-time feedback and control. You may have the smart interconnects that allow us to stream the data and that basically open up bandwidth reservations across the network, something that ESNet provides, and reserve bandwidth and really stream this data at high performance speeds from one experimental facility, for example. And then much more special hardware accelerators used for analytics, for instance. We certainly hear about this in areas like in autonomous vehicles, but I think we also need to think about what types of hardware are we going to need for some of these types of devices in in science. So specialized hardware is emerging that's going to be, an order of magnitude or more faster than estimated to be more than $4 billion investment in startup operation. But the concern is that I are very focused on a class of algorithms, convolutional neural nets, deep learning based on those types of frameworks. And when we look at other much more complicated scientific data sets with many more variables rather than just pixels, or you have three-dimensional structure, or you have graphs, obviously some of the companies are looking at that as well, but we really need to think about what science will need, as well as what some of the commercial applications will need. So there's just a picture of the AI chip landscape, and I won't try to read this or anything, but there's obviously just a lot of activity going on in this space. So the last piece of this is just really looking at how we think about our HPC facilities and facility integration across experiments and facilities. This is a picture of the next system that will be installed at NERSC at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, the Perlmutter system, which is named, of course, after Saul Perlmutter here in the picture. And I won't read through the details of this. It will be a hybrid CPU-GPU system with some CPU-only nodes and some CPU-GPU nodes, really designed to meet a very broad workload that NERSC has. It has over 7,000 users, who a lot of whom do high-performance simulation, but we are certainly seeing a big increase at NERSC in the interest in using deep learning. And there's always been at NERSC a large component of experimental and observational data that's processed originally on a small cluster that was sort of standalone cluster for the experimental facilities, because it didn't seem like they needed big HPC systems. But it turned out over time, first of all, that small cluster was more expensive than operating a piece of the HPC system, and also the data sets now have just gone through the roof for these experiments. And so they are really using now the HPC systems. But the other unique thing about this system is the Cray Slingshot network, which has both high performance, interconnect, but also a Ethernet compatible interface, so we can literally stream data from a remote experiment across, say, ESNet, across a wide area network, and then into the file system and into the compute nodes on the system. So I had coined the phrase, or somebody else actually at Berkeley Lab, I adopted the phrase super facility. We really like to think about now the scientific user facilities as being much more tightly integrated. So it's not that you just have a bunch of genome sequencers or a telescope, and then you've got an HPC facility that's focused on simulation, but you really need to integrate these HPC facilities into and with experimental facilities because of the data rates, because of the sizes of the community data sets. And although I've mostly talked about these big sort of experiments, which is the sweet spot for maybe a lot of the Department of Energy research, because they run a lot of these big user facilities within the U.S., but also looking at things like environmental sensors, or tiny sequencers that can be used all over the place, even on a drone landing in the water and collecting some data, things like that, and then data that's collected from devices, instruments on your smartphone. Vibration sensors looking at, and this environmental sensors looking at earthquakes. This is actually using the embedded dark fiber, but there are a lot of places in which we can be collecting environmental and other types of data in the wild from small sensors and sensor networks, in addition to these big, huge experimental devices. But this is really saying that I think we need to think about the integrated system of scientific facilities, not just HPC facilities separately from experiments with a network separately as well. So I think automation is going to be a key in this facility integration. So kind of taking AI now and using it for AI for science. So the ability to co-schedule and experiment systems between a network, the computation, and the experimental instrument, so that you can have the computing and the network bandwidth you need for that particular experiment that you're doing. things like looking for congestion and anomaly detection in the network or on the computer system, whether it's inside the HPC system or between it, control and recording the experiments. A really interesting project we have at the lab is looking at automatic labeling of data. In fact, there's a couple of different projects looking at different approaches. Some of them are using the context information about where an experiment was performed, and others are really using the images, for example, themselves. And then, of course, using automation, already we use that in our data archives. So just a little bit on the national and international context briefly. There's been a lot of reports in the U.S. on this, looking at, this was a town hall report that I worked on with Rick Stevens and Jeff Nichols, looking at AI for science. In fact, this talk was really originally developed for the Berkeley Town Hall, but the CCC, the Computing Community Consortium, has a fairly lengthy roadmap on AI that advises NSF and all of these other places. And of course, countries all around the world have had your AI intelligence strategies. And so over the past few years, a number of them have been developed. So there's really a lot of work on this all around the world to help understand AI. But in our case, thinking about really what does AI mean for science. And with that, I'll just leave you with sort of a vision of the future, which is that algorithms and systems automatically respond to scientific inquiries, so that you can imagine asking a question and then having an experiment that is partly built automatically for you or with your input. Much more interactive team science. If we've learned anything over the last 6 months, it's that we can have a lot of these collaborations online, and that actually opens more opportunities for international collaborations. So a lot of robotics and control, high performance software, and machine learning on our computing platforms, as well as edge devices, and then these much more integrated facilities and sharing and management of data. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Yelick.